You are listening to MCC GeoPod, the geopolitical podcast of the Mátyás Corvinus Collegium, the largest talent management institute in Hungary. If you want to know more about our mission, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or check out our Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter channels. For interesting articles and analysis of our professors and students, look up our knowledge base at Corvinák.hu/en.
So welcome everyone to this new episode of MCC GeoPod, the Mátyás Corvinus Collegium's geopolitical monthly podcast. We're going to talk about the recent NATO summit, which was taking place in Brussels and had many very interesting and important issues on the table. And we are especially very happy to welcome a Hungarian who was there actually at the summit and not just read the commentary, and has a tremendous experience in defense and security policy. So today we are joined by Péter Siklósi, a defense councillor at the Hungarian delegation, permanent delegation to NATO. Thank you, Péter, for being here with us today.
Thank you very much for the invitation.
And as always, my co-host Attila Demkó, head of MCC Center for Geopolitics, is also here with us today. So again, Attila, welcome home. So first, Péter, please, just to start off, tell us a bit more about your professional background so that the listeners can get to know you better a bit, and about the main, cornerstones of your current position at the Hungarian delegation in Brussels.
My first profession, I'm a pilot, and then I changed course and dived into security and defense policy. And since 1998, I'm working for the government, first in the Prime Minister's office, and then from the year 2000 in the Ministry of Defense. First as a head of department, then 3 years here in NATO, and then 8 years as a Deputy State Secretary for Defense Policy. That ended in 2018, and since then I am here in our NATO delegation again.
Yes, and you had the chance to participate at a very interesting summit, NATO summit of the 2021. It was the first summit which was attended by the new elected US President Joe Biden as well. The press and many analysts had awaited, therefore, very much the final communique. How would you evaluate the outcome and the political echo of this meeting generally, and from a Hungarian perspective in particular?
For the overwhelming majority of the allies, NATO members, the most important thing of this summit was to welcome the new US president with a sigh of relief that he is not Trump. Basically, that was the general feeling. Europeans and the US administration as well, and also Canada, felt that they are back to their old comfort zone. This administration is the most important positions are filled with people who are well known to this community. So basically, everybody was back to the old comfort zone. But this does not mean that the Americans are sending different messages. They are sending exactly the same messages like Trump or the Trump administration. First, Europe has to take a much bigger share of the burden, financial burden. This is formulated in a much more eloquent way, not like Europe has to pay or Germany has to pay, little bit more eloquently, but basically the message is the same.
But sorry to interrupt you, but there was, I think, maybe because of the tone, but this was one of the most controversial statements of Trump, or at least the tone was not received like very warmly by certain, mainly European member states. So, but what you're saying now, that Biden's message is basically the same, but he said it in a more elegant way. So
yeah, absolutely. And I'm pretty much convinced that Trump was very useful and very successful in putting through the message. Because Trump's message wasn't new. Already through various US administrations, this message was also told to the Europeans. But the Europeans did not really listen because it was not forceful enough. Trump was forceful enough, and they started to listen. And now they can claim that we are happily doing that with this nice new guy in the White House. So basically, everybody was happy with that. With what not that many was happy was the other unchanged US message, and that is China. For the US, it is very obvious that everything is about China. Trump, under the Trump era, it was also very clear, but with Biden, it is the same. So we will deal with China in depth, but it's very clear that in NATO we will deal with China a lot. About the other major powers, Germany was very happy. First, because it was not Trump anymore. Second, because there were no troop withdrawals on the table anymore. And third, because the Americans promised them not to sanction Nord Stream 2. So a happy Germany. And it became very clear that the Americans are, after the UK leaving the EU, will very much build their strategy, European strategy, on Germany. So a happy Germany. The French behaved the usual way. They were spoiling the party. This time, not with a Macron statement about NATO being brain dead, but about trying to stop, and at the end, basically stopping the increase of common funding, which would have been the flagship project of the outgoing Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg. Maybe about the topics, there is a new buzzword here, which is resilience. This is quite an undefined territory at the moment. Many try to understand it as domestic political meaning as well. In the statements and in the papers and the agreements, there is no mentioning of that. But naturally, we will have to pay attention of who is defining this area of resilience in what ways? It is clear that resilience has a military meaning as well, and it's a very important area. NATO has pushed forward the normal deterrence and defense agenda. Heads of state and government agreed to various documents which pushed forward this agenda, which is basically the essence of NATO. This went under the radar of the press because of Biden and because of China and resilience and other issues. But this is very important because it is becoming more and more clear that NATO, the allies, basically, will need more forces on higher readiness in the future. And all of this is very expensive. So we will have to spend more on defense. And maybe the last point I would like to stress is that the go-ahead was given to the formulation of the new or renewed strategigic concept. It has to be ready by the next summit, which will be sometime during the summer of 2022. So we have a year to write this new or renewed strategic concept. And it's very clear that the most important issue during the debates will be the role of China in this new strategic concept.
Yes, and before speaking of China, now, Attila, I have two phrases for you because originally I only wanted to ask you about what does America is back mean in your understanding, but now we've got the other buzzword, resilience. So now you've got to deal with these two buzzwords. What are these? What do they mean in your understanding in this context? America is back, like the main motto of Biden. Peter has already touched upon it, and this new buzzword, resilience.
Well, I believe that America has never left. So this America is back. It's a buzzword, and resilience is a buzzword too. I mean, from time to time, NATO and the United States and all big organizations have some words what to follow as an important goal, but otherwise, most of the NATO's work is going on. I mean, resilience is just a flagship, an undefined flagship project. But back to the United States. So why I say the US has never left? Actually, the Trump administration was, of course, there was a big difference in style, and style does matter, and personalities do matter. So in that sense, the Trump administration was a very different administration. But in terms of interest, in terms of what the United States actually did on Ukraine, for example, or Russia, was very tough. They never ever left Ukraine. Of course, you can always do the tricks that like the press did on Trump when he didn't allow one shipment of arms to Ukraine to show that well he's supporting the Russians. No, actually he did a lot to strengthen Ukraine. And if you see now what the Biden administration is doing, if the Trump administration had done the same, not stopping Nord Stream 2, for example. Can you imagine what would have happened if Trump is doing the same, like letting the Russians and the Germans finish Nord Stream 2? I mean, everybody would have cried that Trump is in somehow connected to the Russians. So it didn't happen with Biden. So that's why I say that style and personality does matter. It matters a lot. And otherwise, if we see, I mean, President Biden didn't say to the very eloquent words and questions by Mr. President Zelensky that if what will happen to Ukraine's NATO membership, and of course he couldn't say that Ukraine can join in the foreseeable future the alliance. It's just not America is back or not. There are certain realities in the world, and even the United States cannot bend reality. The last time America believed that it can bend reality, can form reality, was Iraq and Afghanistan, and both of them are pretty big failures. You cannot bend. You don't really. It's not the world of Star Wars that you imagine things and they happen. So you don't have a stable Iraq. You don't have a stable Afghanistan. You don't have a stable Ukraine. And actually, without agreeing with some not so nice people like the Taliban and President Putin, there will never be a relatively stable Afghanistan, because I don't see a stable Afghanistan in the forthcoming few decades. And I don't really see a prosperous Ukraine in the forthcoming few decades without a certain agreement with Russia. This is fact on the ground. And I think the Biden administration is doing well with acknowledging the facts. And then the other fact is that America needs NATO. And that's why I think it's important that no more talk about NATO being obsolete is coming from DC. It's not a one-way street. It's not only of course the Europeans need the United States much more. This is basic reality. But the United States needs Europe too. It's not an easy game, especially if the US wants to address China, the challenge of China. So I would say that these are really buzzwords. It's good to talk about them, good to mention them. Resilience and America is back, but we should go deeper, and that's what I think we should do here in this conversation.
Yes, and we're gonna definitely talk about Afghanistan and the Ukraine as well. But before, let me quote from the final document. It says that until Russia demonstrates compliance with international law and its international obligations and responsibilities, there can be no return to business as usual, end quote. And yes, we're going to touch on another country, China, that is also frequently mentioned in the statement. But the so-called winner, I actually counted how many times did it mention Russia and China, is still Russia. However, it doesn't inevitably or necessarily mean that it will still be the main threat politically or militarily to NATO or other Western alliances, or maybe I'm wrong. What do you think, Peter?
When we are speaking about challengers to the West, I think that's a different thing compared to challenges to NATO. Because NATO is obviously the most important international organization in the transatlantic geographical area, but the world is bigger than that. But I think we will get to that when we talk about China. About Russia, NATO has a very clearly defined role nowadays, and there are two threats which NATO is facing. One is coming from the east, the other one is coming from the south. The eastern one is easily definable. It's called Russia at the moment, and it is a very well-known threat to NATO. NATO spent the first 40 years of its existence getting know that threat, and the whole apparatus of NATO is very well accustomed to the Russian challenge. The other threat is coming from the south, which is a much more diverse and much harder to define a type of threat. But NATO currently is preparing against both of them. Against the Russian challenge, we can prepare in much more concrete terms and more concrete decisions, plans, and so on. Against the southern threat, which is, as I said, much less definable, it's much harder to plan against these threats. But NATO is doing that in a certain way, as far as it can do it right now. I wouldn't like to go much more deeper into that because we are arriving to NATO secret territory here. But about Russia, from NATO is a political and military, or military and political organization. And military planners assess capabilities and not intentions. And it's very important to assess capabilities. Of course, we have to be aware of the intentions as well, but intentions can change very rapidly, capabilities cannot. And Russia is very strong in some usable military capabilities. First of all, it has a very quick decision-making process. So it can out-decide NATO, if I may use this word, very much. Then Russia has strong land forces in numbers as well as in technology right now. We could go into who is more advanced and who is not, but they clearly have a strong military and especially a strong land force. And at the same time, they also have a very strong missile capability, with which they can threaten NATO territory from a 360 degrees. So not only from the east, but they can threaten it from the oceans as well as from the air. And then these are the capabilities. And then on the intentions side, we all hope that Putin does not have an intention to attack Europe. Most probably he does not. But what we do know is Putin is very good in using opportunities. When he sees a good opportunity to gain something, then he can decide very quickly and use that opportunity. And there is a history of recent hostile actions like Salisbury, the Czech ammo depot issue, cyber attacks, and so on. So basically, this is what motivates NATO nowadays towards Russia.
Attila?
Yeah, well, I want to react to what you said and what is in the statement, business as usual. Do you think, anybody thinks that Russia wants to return to business as usual? For Russia, business as usual was NATO growing and growing and getting closer to the Russian heartland. That was business as usual for Russia. And of course, I'm very happy about that because Hungary could join NATO and many of our neighbors could join. But there are certain limits to Russian patience, and I don't think that they want to return to business as usual. They want to have clear lines in the sand. And what is a clear line in the sand? And I think the great thing that the Biden administration is seemingly starting to understand this is Ukraine. And I don't think that any pre-2014 imagination about Ukraine or Georgia joining NATO is feasible until Russia is not changing from the inside. And actually, I have bad news. I don't think that even after Putin, Russia will change its mind on Ukraine for one single reason. What Peter said is the most important. Every country, and especially great powers, are preparing for what is possible. Intentions can change, but geography and capabilities are not so easily changeable. So if there is a Ukraine within NATO, and NATO is friendly to Russia, what's the problem for Moscow? Well, the problem is that NATO can change, Ukraine can change, and anyway, this train has already left. But even that eventuality, we should think with the Russian mind, and that was the big mistake. What we did in the West of not thinking on the Russian, trying to think as our at the time, Russia was not adversary, today is, but to think as the opponent or the opposition party thinks. So that's why I don't think business as usual is in any way or shape or form is Russia's intention. Russia's intention is for NATO to accept that Ukraine and Georgia will never be members of NATO, and of course Belarus will never be a member of any type of Western community. You always forget that Belarus is the shortest way to Moscow. That's a few armies used, starting from Napoleon to the German army in the Second World War. And we shouldn't like this idea that Moscow can decide on the future of other countries. But it's not about liking; it's about realities. They can decide, because in both Belarus and Ukraine, they have the high ground, and they will do anything to keep it. So that's my reaction. That in some ways I see a very strong. And I hope that it's not wishful thinking. A strong return to reality, and this was shown by the NATO summit, but especially by the Biden-Putin summit. So, return to reality should be the buzzword, not resilience. A return to reality.
And what do you think now? Then, given this bigger picture that you have described, the Hungarian reality as a neighboring country of the Ukraine and the Hungarian community in Transcarpathia. So what's the reality for them?
First of all, Hungary is famously blocking Ukraine, but Hungary is only blocking the high-level meetings with Ukraine and not cooperation. There is a very strong group of allies who don't want Ukraine in NATO ever. I don't think I disclose any secrets here, but Germany, the Netherlands, France, and some others are among these countries. And many of these countries are hiding behind the back of Hungary here, because they don't have to disclose that they will never allow Ukraine into NATO. Why? Because what Attila also mentioned, Ukraine is vital for Russia, and they don't want to have a direct confrontation with Russia here. So my personal assessment, and this is not Hungarian government policy, my personal assessment of Ukraine's chances of becoming a member, not much.
I have another phrase for you, actually, from the text, which appears several times, systemic challenges. The text says, or the statement, the NATO statement, that China presents systemic challenges to the rules-based international order. How should we understand this phrase in light of, well, all the circumstances and all the information that we have, that we read, that we learn about Chinese global strategy and expansion? Peter?
If I may, the phrase systemic challenges, I think, was invented to not to use other more defined phrases like Second Cold War, or things like that. Under systemic challenger, you can understand various things. So I think this was invented to blur this. And why do you have to blur this? Because although it's very clear that China is the most important issue for the United States, and consequently, it will be the most important issue in the new strategic concept. And it is also very clear that the US wants a role for NATO against China. But at the moment, the US seemingly does not know exactly what role it wants from NATO. So there has to be a role, but what? That's the question. Now, many of the Europeans don't want a role for NATO in this. And from a military perspective, NATO is not even the right tool. There are many reasons for that, but let me mention two of them. First, the distance. NATO is about the North Atlantic, and China is not about the North Atlantic. It's about the Indo-Pacific. And secondly, NATO is basically a land warfare-centric military organization with navies and air forces in a supporting role. And the Chinese military challenge is a maritime-centric challenge. So NATO does not really have a great experience in this. Now, and Europe, contrary to the past Cold War, where Europe was the main theater, here Europe is not the main theater. It's a secondary theater. The role of Europe and consequently the role of NATO is keeping Russia at bay. So, in my opinion, Article 5 of NATO does not apply to a Chinese situation. Article 4, yes, it applies. Consultation is a possibility. And if we are looking for a role, or if the Americans are looking for a role for NATO, then they might find, or they might try to push the Europeans towards a role for NATO in preserving our technological edge. Maybe. We will see.
Yes, and Attila, I would like to ask about your opinion as well. And especially, like an additional question, I would be really curious of what you think about the Chinese perspective. So how China sees the NATO.
Well, it's a very good question, how the Chinese are seeing NATO. And I had the opportunity to hear their opinion. Even back in 2006, they saw NATO as, let's say, ally. Yeah, of course, NATO is the system of allies for the United States, but let's say they saw the NATO countries as very close allies who will follow the United States to many places. And I think in this they were wrong, and they are wrong to see NATO as NATO countries as automatically following the US on every crisis and every issue. But we have to see again what is the mindset of the other side. The mindset of the other side is that the whole organization can be a problem for them. And what the Chinese saw, actually the Chinese saw the NATO flag in a neighboring country. We always forget that Afghanistan is a neighboring country of China. So from a few kilometers of the Chinese, few dozen kilometers from a Chinese flag post, there was a flag post with a NATO flag on it. So I completely agree with Peter that NATO is not really the organization beyond solidarity, beyond some secondary missions to stand up to China. If the United States wants to do that Quad can possibly do that. I mean, India, Japan, Australia. They are in the geographic region, but of course, for the Chinese, they do have the mindset that NATO is a problem, even an enemy. And if this language is being used, and what we use this language now in NATO, it will reinforce it. But it doesn't change the facts. Again, facts are important. Reality is important. NATO countries are in Europe mostly, North America. And they are not really close to China. They don't really have direct problems with China. So when the US wants to build an alliance to maintain balance in the region, I think India and Japan is, of course, much more important than NATO countries. I think what the Americans want is solidarity. There is only one exception from what I said, if there is one day a real Russian-Chinese alliance. Because then, if Russia and China works together even more strongly, they are working together now, but if they work together in a more formal way, then NATO has much more role against China because it has a role against Russia. So we have to see how the relationship between China and Russia evolves. But of course, that evolution is also partly based on what we do, what the West is doing. If we force Russia into the hands of China, as the Russians see it, again, we have to look at their way, not only our way. Then yes, I think NATO will have a role against China in the form of Russia. But this is not. We are not here yet. We are not in such a bad situation yet. So I think this little turn of American policy on Russia is maybe linked also to the possibility of a stronger Chinese-Russian cooperation.
Leslie, I would like you to comment on the US withdrawal from Afghanistan.
In a certain way, it is over because it became clear that the United States, NATO, or we can say the West, got tired of Afghanistan. And that's one side of the story. Other side of the story is that with a peer competitor on the horizon, China again, the US cannot afford to divide her attention, her resources, her forces in an unnecessary way. And Afghanistan is not that important anymore. In the world of 20 years ago, with 9/11 and the huge terrorist attacks, not only on US soil, that was the most important issue of the day. And at that time, China was not that big on the horizon. Times change, and by now, this emphasis on Afghanistan is, I think, gone for good. The interesting consequences are what we can also see nowadays with more than 1,000 Afghan government troops going over the border in order to avoid being captured, is that Central Asia, the Central Asian countries, the Istans, the other Istans, are threatened by uncertainty because of the advance of the Taliban, which means that Russia for sure, but maybe even China also will feel the heat, which might mean, and there are already signs of this, that the Russians will have to step up again. We might even find ourselves in a world where, with the Americans and the Westerners gone, the Russians will have to step up again. Maybe not like they did during the 80s, but they will have to concentrate some resources towards Afghanistan. And of course, one very important dimension of this issue is that we will definitely see a new migration wave with the Taliban advancing, because those who were comfortable with the Western influence will feel threatened, and many of them will decide to leave. So a new migration wave is on the horizon. That's pretty clear.
Yes, and having spoken of Afghanistan, since we're all Hungarian on this podcast, I would like to end by talking about the Hungarian presence there, in the past in Afghanistan, the troops who served there, and about certain rumors that they will also serve there in the future. I don't know if you could clarify that rumors or articles.
Hungary was in Afghanistan, if my recollection is correct, since 2003, with originally, or at the beginning, very small supportive type of troops, and then bigger and bigger contingents. And then we took over the provincial reconstruction team in Baglan province. So we had we can say, our own province and our own responsibilities there. And we have sent quite a substantial special forces troop contribution to Afghanistan, fighting alongside the Americans. I think the positive side is that the Hungarian military learned a lot in Afghanistan. Especially our special forces. They have gained a lot of respect from our allies. But experience is very important. If you only look at the names of the top generals of Hungary, or the Hungarian military right now, starting from the commander to all the other generals who are in command right now, or have been until a couple of weeks ago, they have all served in Afghanistan in commanding roles, and that is very important. Of course, there are negative and sad sides. The most important is that we have 7 fatal casualties from Afghanistan. We have some wounded from Afghanistan. And of course, we have spent a lot of money there. About the future and about the possible mission you mentioned, we are talking about the Kabul International Airport. Kabul International Airport is a very important place, because that's the place from where everybody will leave Kabul if necessary. I don't really know the details of this, because these issues are not dealt with inside NATO. It is done in bilateral channels, but I'm absolutely sure of one thing. There will be no, here we are talking about a Turkish-led mission with the possible contribution of Hungary, some other countries like Pakistan, and the support of the United States. So I'm pretty sure of one thing. Turkey will not attempt to do this mission without the help of the United States and without some kind of a consent of the Taliban. So with a hostile Taliban, which might take over the country pretty soon, it would be a suicide attempt to make an operation there. And I'm pretty sure that the Hungarian government is also knowledgeable about this issue and will not go into such a risky operation.
Attila, any final thoughts?
That's my educated guess.
Yes. Thank you, Peter. Attila?
Well, I completely agree with Peter. We have a lot of experience. HDF, Hungarian Defense Forces, a lot of experience in Afghanistan. They have an experience at the airport. So we had troops at the airport, and we had a lot of officers who served there several tours, and we know the environment in Kabul. And that in that sense, we could be a good addition to Turkey. But we also have to say that it would be an extremely dangerous mission. It's very easy to attack Kabul airport. It's in a valley. If you are at the airport, I have been several times. You can see the city. If you can see the city, they can see you. And if the Taliban wants to attack or Al Qaeda or ISIL the airport, it's not that hard. So it's not an easy mission, but definitely if the West wants to keep a foothold in Kabul, the airport is the most important place. Go to Afghanistan and to come out of Afghanistan if necessary. And we have seen it before. What happens when the Talibs take over Kabul? It's not nice. But very important. What Peter said about the geopolitics of Afghanistan. It's not that important for Europe or for the US. It's important for Europe because of a possible migration wave. But in itself, it's not that important for Europe. But it's important for those who are in Central Asia. And China and Russia is in Central Asia, and it can have an impact. Afghanistan can have an impact on the stability of Central Asia. And of course, it's important. This country is very important for Pakistan and India. So these countries have much higher stakes in keeping Afghanistan stable. And despite this fact, for 20 years, the West invested immense amounts of money to keep Afghanistan stable, which was unsuccessful. And I don't think that there was any way to be successful in Afghanistan. So it was, for anybody who thought that it will be a successful mission, I think those had a very, very rosy dream, since Afghanistan is a big country. Afghanistan is a very fragmented country. And if you look at Bosnia, Herzegovina or Kosovo, we're in these very small countries. Are we that successful? Are NATO and the EU is that successful in this country? So it's not easy to solve these conflicts. It's not a mistake of the West. It's not a mistake of NATO. It was extremely hard to solve all the problems a society like the Afghan society has. So from now on, it's going to be for others to try to keep the problems of Afghanistan within Afghanistan. And actually, it's a strategically, it's a good thing for the West to live. We can talk about the moral implications. We can talk about how it looks. It doesn't look good. for the United States or NATO to leave Afghanistan in such a way. Some say to leave Afghanistan in defeat, but we shouldn't look that way. We should look with cool heads. And from now on, it's for Russia, China, Pakistan, and India and Iran to keep Afghanistan in order. Not all resources will be spent on Afghanistan. So, from a geopolitical point of view, I think it was a good move. It was a sober move. It's not a happy day to see leaving Afghanistan in such a circumstance, but still, this is the good decision.
Péter and Attila, thank you very much for this very informative and insightful conversation.
Thank you for listening to this MCC GeoPod episode. For further media content, please look up our English website at mcc.hu/en or look for us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. If you want to read more by our professors and students, check out our knowledge base at Corvinák.hu/en.